from Worldpeacefull, and I've just been feeling very inspired to share with you the works of Francis Bacon, who I feel may well be a fellow traveller to me. He lived from 1561 to 1626. So what I'm going to do is read you some of his story, as he's a fascinating character in history. The book I'm reading from is actually about the Renaissance, which I feel parallels the times we're moving through. We need enlightened thinkers and feelers, and many of these enlightenment greats were poets themselves and philosophers, so they were thinking creatively. These days, poets are not seen in the same light, and often they produce literature on poetry, and it's actually not well understood or well known in society. Unfortunately, the technological era has kind of taken away those spaces where poets may have had an opportunity to share the wisdom that they found within themselves. So Francis Bacon, philosopher, essayist, jurist, politician, naturalist, classicist, historian, and utopian fantasist. Francis Bacon had an extraordinary capacity to range throughout the world of learning while keeping a focus on the practical uses of knowledge, able not only to master the traditions of the past, but also to combine, manipulate, and consolidate old concepts into fruitful new ideas. His essays, memorable distillations of his wide reading and worldly experience, are still widely read and enjoyed. His philosophical writings, in both Latin and English, aim at nothing less than the reformation of humanity's approach to understanding nature and society. Ironically, it can be hard for us now, reading from the other side of the revolution he helped accelerate, to appreciate the full impact of Bacon's philosophy. He did not fully develop what some call the scientific method, or anticipate the crucial role of mathematics in later scientific developments. What he did accomplish in his philosophy and in his often terse style, in brackets, deliberately free, usually from flights of metaphor or fancy, was to anchor the mind more firmly in experience and to lend momentum to a new sense of worldly inquiry and expectation. It would be unfair to hold him responsible, as some have done, for the dangers and excesses inherent in modern science and its assumptions. Indeed, in the New Atlantis, Bacon himself hints presciently that increased power over nature should be accompanied by increased love and gratitude. He says, "I had rather studied books than men." Bacon concluded late in his life, but his origins made vast ambitions in both the political and intellectual spheres seem almost inevitable. His father, Sir Nicholas Bacon, was Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, one of the most powerful ministers in the Elizabethan government. His mother, Anne Cook, was an erudite and devout Calvinist who instilled in her son a deep sense of purpose and passion for knowledge, which is really interesting. Shows you the women had influence in those times as well. Cambridge student at 12, assistant to the ambassador to France at 16, barrister and member of Parliament by age of 23. Bacon achieved much early, but his father's untimely death in 1579 left him short of funds and without direct influence at court. He was not well liked by Elizabeth, and it was not until the accession of James I that his star began to rise, knighted in 1603. He was appointed Solicitor General in 1607, Attorney General in 1613, Privy Councillor in 1616, Lord Keeper of the Seal in 1617, and finally Lord Chancellor in 1618. acquiring along the way the titles of Baron Verulam and Viscount St Albans. In quotes, by indignities men come to dignities. By indignities men come to dignities. Bacon wrote in his essay of Great Place, conscious no doubt of the reputation of sycophancy and scheming he had acquired in his quest for power and position, and the standing is slippery. And I won't read the rest of his history there. I'm just having a scan over this. Yes, his grand design was for a renewal of knowledge, and that's what we're needing right now. It says here its vital innovation was a reclassification of knowledge so as to separate theology from natural philosophy. So this is at a time when, religion and theology were the dominant modes even of education. And the Renaissance was the separation of this into natural philosophy. So the philosophers arose at this time. And philosophers arise during times of great change as they're seeking truth because it's an uncertain future. It's quite natural for philosophy to happen, and it can happen inside anyone. He was also a poet as well. I'm just going to read a little bit out of his essay, and it's called Of Truth. What is truth? Said jesting Pilate, and would not stay for an answer. Certainly there be that delight in giddiness, and count it a bondage to fix a belief, affecting free will in thinking as well as in acting. And though the sex of philosophers of that kind be gone, yet there remain certain discoursing wits, which are the same veins, though there be not so much blood in them as was in those of the ancients. But it is not only the difficulty and labour which men take in finding out of truth, nor again that when it is found it imposeth upon men's thoughts that doth bring lies in favour, but a natural though corrupt love of the lie itself. One of the latter school of the Grecians examineth the matter, and is at a stand to think what should be in it, that men should love lies, where neither they make for pleasure, as with poets, nor for advantage, as with the merchant, but for the lie's sake. But I cannot tell. This same truth is a naked and open daylight that doth not show the masks and mummeries and triumphs of the world half so stately and daintily as candle lights. Truth may perhaps come to the price of a pearl that showeth best by day, but it will not rise to the price of a diamond or carbuncle that showeth best in varied lights. A mixture of lie doth ever add pleasure. Doth any man doubt that if there were taken out of men's minds vain opinions, flattering hopes, false valuations, imaginations as one would, and the like, but it would leave the minds of a number of men poor shrunken things, full of melancholy and indisposition, and unpleasing to themselves. One of the fathers in great severity called poesy, which is poetry, vinum deonomen. I'll read that again because I'm not a Latin speaker. Vinum daemonum, because it filleth the imagination, and yet it is but with the shadow of a lie. But it is not the lie that passeth through the mind, but the lie that sinketh in and settleth in it, that doth the hurt. such as we spake of before. But howsoever these things are thus in men's depraved judgments and affections, yet truth, which only doth judge itself, teacheth that the inquiry of truth, which is the love-making or wooing of it, the knowledge of truth, which is the presence of it, and the belief of truth, which is the enjoying of it, is the sovereign good of human nature. Yeah, that touches my heart. There's nothing more beautiful than truth. I remember, I'm just going to interrupt this, because we are speaking his beautiful words, St. Francis Bacon. I just want to say that when I've spaketh the truth, the truth is myself up. It's like a purification. When you discover the truth, and I could cry very easily. That's how you know it's truth, you see, you can feel it. When I've earnestly spoken the truth, which is pretty much my modus operandi, it feels really good to do so. To lie doesn't feel good at all. There's a weakening with lying. And what it does is it sets deep inside people's characters. And then the lie becomes the truth because they say it so much. And if they've got a glee club around them, the others will reinforce that lie. So it sounds like a truth. Truth is a great threat to people because it reveals. But the untruth in that is that a lie is never who we are. We're just in a lie because of a fear that we're carrying. The real truth, when you speak it and face it, there's a great purity that happens. Maybe some of these Enlightenment thinkers who were so deeply searching for it, it's part of their spiritual quest as well. I'll read on. He goes, the first creature of God in the works of the days was the light of the sense. The last was the light of reason. The light of the sense, that's the feeling. The last was the light of reason, that's the thinking logic. And his Sabbath work ever since is the illumination of his spirit. First, he breathed light upon the face of the matter of chaos. Then he breathed light into the face of man. And still he breatheth and inspireth light into the face of his chosen. It's a lovely bird just nearby. Just noticing. I want to read that bit. He breatheth and inspireth light into the face of his chosen. And light is truth, is information. The poet that beautified the sect that was otherwise inferior to the rest saith yet excellently well, it is a pleasure to stand upon the shore and to see ships tossed upon the sea, a pleasure to stand in the window of a castle and to see a battle and the adventures thereof below, but no pleasure is comparable to the standing upon the vantage ground of truth. In brackets, a hill not to be commanded, and where the air is always clear and serene, and to see the errors and wanderings and mists and tempests in the vale below. So always that this prospect be with pity, and not with swelling or pride. Certainly it is heaven upon earth to have a man's mind move in charity, rest in providence, and turn upon the poles of truth. This is heaven on earth, and I felt the same thing when I've written my poetry. I may write a poem on Francis Bacon, and I might do that today. He goes on to say, to pass from theological and philosophical truth to the truth of civil business, it will be acknowledged even by those that practice it not, that clear and round dealing is the honour of man's nature, and that mixture of falsehood is like alloy in coin of gold and silver, which may make the metal work the better, but it embaseth it. For these winding and crooked courses are the goings of the serpent. A little bit of wind. Are the goings of the serpent, which goeth basely upon the belly, and not upon the feet. There is no vice that doth so cover a man with shame as to be found false and perfidious. And therefore Montaigne saith prettily, when he inquired the reason why the word of the lie should be such a disgrace and such an odious charge, saith he, in quotes, if it be well weighed, to say that a man lieth is as much to say as that he is brave towards God and a coward towards men. For a lie faces God and shrinks from man. Surely the wickedness of falsehood and breach of faith cannot possibly be so highly expressed as in that it shall be the last pearl to call the judgments of God upon the generations of men, it being foretold that when Christ cometh, he shall not find faith upon the earth. Interesting. I'm just having a quick scan over his essay because he talks about marriage and travel, plantations in this essay. Let's see if anything jumps out at me. Feel this love connecting to this. In fact, this whole book is really interesting because truth is one of my passions. And I'm not saying that I know the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God. I'm still learning. But my intention is for truth, always. And there's nothing wrong for anyone who makes mistakes. There's nothing wrong with making mistakes. It's when we deliberately lie. And when we do so in the service of a bigger lie and protecting that deception, it all comes back on you in the end. Talking about secrecy here. This looks interesting. Oh, here we go. This is really good. There be 3 degrees of his hiding and veiling of man's self. The first, closeness, reservation, and secrecy, when a man leaveth himself without observation, or without hold to be taken, what he is. The second, dissimulation, is the negative, when a man lets fall signs and arguments that he is not that he is. And the third simulation, in the affirmative, when a man industriously and expressly feigns and pretends to be that he is not. For the first of these, secrecy, it is indeed the virtue of a confessor, and assuredly the secret man heareth many confessions. For who will open himself to a blab or a blabbler, or a babbler? But if a man be thought secret, it inviteth discovery, as the more close air sucketh in the more open. And as in confession, the revealing is not for worldly use, but for the ease of a man's heart. So secret men come to the knowledge of many things in that kind, while men rather discharge their minds than impart their minds. In few words, mysteries are due to secrecy. Besides, to say truth, nakedness is uncomely. It's interesting. As well in the mind as body, and it addeth no small reverence to men's manners and actions, if they be not altogether open. As for talkers and futile persons, that could be me. They are commonly vain and credulous. It's not me. Withal, for he that talketh what he knoweth will also talk what he knoweth not. Therefore set it down that A habit of secrecy is both politic and moral. Kind of like keeping your own counsel. There's wisdom in the silence. And then there's those who just speak, it was a term I was going to use, but I won't. People who just speak off the cuff, they're just talking for the sake of it. That's what it means by talkative. I'm actually making a distinction because I'm a person who expresses through communication, as do a lot of women. And this was a time of men. And there's some judgment being levelled at those who talk. But I imagine what he's meaning there is people who speak for the sake of it, not for real meaning or purpose. So he's saying here, a habit of secrecy is both politic and moral. So there's keeping one's own counsel is the way I'm saying that. And in this part, it is good that a man's face give his tongue leave to speak. For the discovery of a man's self by the tracks of his countenance is a great weakness and betraying. For the discovery of a man's self by the tracks of his countenance is a great weakness and betraying, by how much it is many times more marked and believed than a man's words. For the second, which is dissimulation, it followeth many times upon secrecy by necessity, so that he that will be secret must be a dissembler in some degree. For men are too cunning to suffer a man to keep an indifferent carriage between both, and to be secret without swaying the balance of either side. They will so beset a man with questions and draw him on and pick it out of him, that without an absurd silence he must show an inclination one way, or if he do not, they will gather as much by his silence as by his speech. There's truth in that. As for equivocations or oracular speeches, they cannot hold out long, so that no man can be secret except he give himself a little scope of dissimulation, which is, as it were, but the skirts or train of secrecy. It's interesting. But see, truth, I just want to reflect this in the modern time, and I don't know if I'm understanding Francis that well. I'm simply reflecting on that in respect of not running off at the mouth. But I see that as a transparency, you see. In many respects, not thinking before you speak. There's a transparency there. Some people call that spontaneity. I just call it transparency. But if you're speaking with meaning, not for the sake of speaking. For example, I could go out with a group of people and not say that much. I could just listen. But I find I have a lot of thoughts, and I allow those thoughts. I don't create barriers, and I don't protect my vulnerabilities, you see, because for me the truth is protection. If I'm completely honest about something, even if it reveals myself more to the point where I can be critiqued, I allow that critiquing to happen, because that's transparency. It's like the agora situation for the Greeks, when the senators were all gathering in the agora to speak to each other. The problem where truth can get distorted is when people become clever and they manipulate situations in order to win that argument. And this is where Descartes' reductionist thinking, the argument, which has been very much a foundation at universities. Its idea was to challenge truths and to win through superior knowledge. But that can become one of conquest, where men are sort of jousting like they would if they were in a battle, trying to win over the other in order to inflate their own sense of superiority. And I don't believe that's enunciating the truth. To me, truth should come from the heart, where you are really seeking answers. And you're not seeking to win against the other party, you're seeking to put a perspective, and that other is free to also put their perspective or not. And if they don't answer you, and I see the silence in that is when you're not answered, when there's not a visibility there, it then creates a perception that there's something being hidden. And that's when deception arises in the mind of the other, of yourself. You see them as being deceptive because they're not being visible. And we're in a world right now where people are concealing a lot. They're not being open and honest because they're frightened of being seen like the fool, whereas I'm a great advocate of the fool. Better to be foolish and on your own than popular in a crowd of nodders. Everyone is going, yes, 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 you're right. It's better to stand alone in what you feel is your truth. And what is truth, as Francis Bacon started in the beginning. And how do lies sit with people over a period of time. So I guess my message in this, I'm open to all viewpoints. Personally, I'm open to changing my mind. If a greater truth comes to me, I will definitely take it on board. But for the moment, you know, as I'm sort of, I guess you would call me a very independent thinker, at the moment, because of my solo journey, I'm accessing truth from within myself, and I find poetry is the liberator of that. When I write poetry, I'm not thinking, I'm feeling for truth. That's how truth is a feeling thing, it's not a thinking thing. This is where we got it all wrong. There are many people living in truth, but expressing it through their feeling. The word I love you is a truth when it's truly expressed. And it doesn't have to be romantic. You know, for me, it's the love of truth that liberates the word love from my lips. So interesting. I will probably be reading little bits and pieces out of this Renaissance book because these guys were the ones who catalyzed a complete shift in the paradigm at that time. These 17th century thinkers were challenging the old paradigm that was unchallengeable at that time. They challenged it and they brought philosophy in, rationalist thinking, to counter religious edicts that were unquestioned. And today we find ourselves in a world where there's a lot of unquestioned beliefs around business. There is unquestioned beliefs around governance. And in a sense, it mirrors the same thing as these theologian or religious dominated times where it was authoritarian dictatorship through do as we say. I'm seeing that today, and I believe that's why this shift is happening in consciousness, is because we need to again throw the coins down on the table, spread the cards. We need to remind people that we're all equal and we're all one in this world. No one's better than anyone. Why should a person with lots of money live and have access to the best of everything, whereas someone who doesn't have that has the least of everything? And it's got nothing to do with whether they're working or not, in truth. It's an inequality built into a philosophy of a system that values one over the other. And the moment we do that, we step aside from the truth in favour of indulgence and privilege. And that is the very foundation of revolutions. My hope is that at the times we're in right now, we're at the precipice of evolution in consciousness. So with that, I will leave you in peace. And I send you enlightenment through the heart.